MP is asking, could I describe more closely how you think of and attend to the line of shadow in your method of painting? I'm betting I've described that somewhere along the way. But I do like the idea of rather putting it in slow motion and talking about it in more isolated ways than we may have in the past. If you haven't been watching these, you might check on the video with the drawing of the horse in it. What was that called? I wonder, Mr. Producer. But or any of the starts. Some of that information is in the starts, or even maybe in the science. One of those that we use the word science, but you'll find it. I'm going to thank, first of all, Stephen J. Stephen, I hope you're feeling good these days, and thank you very much for that recurring. Linda J, Norma T, and that was a nice size, Norma, and Laura K. All you guys are recurring, and thank you, Norma, for that one. All right, Laura K, Linda J, Stephen J, and Norma T. Okay. All right. For all you guys do. So let's get on. I'm going to read the question, bring it up one more time just so it's there for Mr. Producer. Could you describe more closely how you think of and attend to the line of shadow in your method of painting? So the fun part was Gamel referred to it as the bedbug line. And I've often wondered where the world that came from. I wouldn't be surprised if it came before him, but it seems like sort of a uniquely American kind of a, humor involved in it. I know that DeCamp sometimes would do funny things verbally, but anyway. But the bedbug line. So the theory, of course, is that bedbugs won't go near the light; they only live in the dark. So they're wandering around in theory in the shadows, and that they start wandering across, and they get cut off. They go try again. They want to get across to the other side, and so that forms in a very silly way, a way of thinking about the line of shadow. The Leonardo is the person who actually, I think, first expresses this thing as isolates the concept, shall we say? And Leonardo has that wonderful quality of treating things scientifically, in other words, in the best sense of science. In other words, he's trying to separate this from that, to sort this out and that out. He's the person who talks about the chiaroscuro, the clear and obscure. Various things come out of all this stuff, much related to the Boston School way of painting. But the line of shadow is just, something you can read about again on online. I'm not, any of those websites that talk about the science of light on an object is going to talk about that. The reflected lights, the highlights, the midtones, and all that sort of stuff. But I'm going to show you what I mean by the line of shadow, and then I'm going to show you how we think about it and how we approach drawing that. Some people refer to the shadow line as the third line, and I think that's a pretty reasonable assessment given how you would operate from an outline in the old days. And by the way, the cast you're looking at now has been set up the way we would have done it, something like the way we would have done it under Gamel, with the idea of making a really clear outline. And then your first exercise, much like the Ruskin quote we talked about, was to learn to draw really, really with authority that contour. It's funny when Degas says drawing is what happens between the contours, that he means the modeling. I mean, it must mean everything except the contours, but obviously he would be including the contours. But let's look at this, and I'll talk about Ang too in a second in that context. But so let's look at this. So what you're seeing here is a unit of shadow right there. That's the point at which no light gets in direct light. So you can see on that arm there's a reflective light that's bouncing off of here, presumably. Now, one of those things, if you blur your eyes, you'll see that can still be isolated as a unit, and we do blur our eyes for that purpose, to see the unity of that larger value. But the shadow line exists along here and it's barely visible. Whereas if you go up to the nose, it's more visible. And if you go up to this piece of the hair, it's really almost a sharp edge, or down right through here. So those are all points along these different areas where the shadow resides, where the shadow line resides. And if you think about it, you'll know, it'll occur to you that the shapes, there is a shape element on the line of shadow, going in and going out. You see around here, for example, there's a going in and going out, back out down here, back over here, chin. So that wandering in and out is shape. You're drawing a line. So obviously it's a line. So the question becomes, how do we approach it? Now, the other thing you would want to know is that shadows are flat. That goes with the territory. There's a line of shadow. The shadows, anything not in the direct light is considered flat. Now, flat means having no extra values in it. And it's always an overstatement to say flat. You can set things up so they're virtually flat by putting a black cloth just to the right on the background, not behind this thing because you'd lose your silhouette, but just to the right over there. You could put a black cloth and you can get a virtually flat background. But all backgrounds, if you blur a little bit, are essentially flat. And to express that flatness, and the conversation then goes to, and that's a source of atmosphere, that flatness is. So the form is in the lights. That's all those movements of middle tones. And the shadows are flat. So those are the counterpoints. But you can see things like even this little eye here, this little blip here. These things here are lit. So there would be a shadow line related to that there. There'd be a shadow line related to and this would be what you might call the cast part of the shadow. But we still think of it as shadow line. In the simplistic first version of it I ever heard, all Gamel referred to was the line running down the middle of the face, the shadow line. So I don't know what's happening with my hand out there, Mr. Producer. But there's a shadow line. If I do this right, I'm not sure I can do it right in the multiple lights we have here. But I can drink my coffee. All right. So understand though, now the shadow line, the shadows exist, little plugs of it here and there. Major masses of it here. And at your own peril, you artificially flatten things because you will lose content. So you have to know where the shadow line, how do we do that? We actually, and so you talk about method now, we actually will hold a charcoal stick. So if you pretend that point there is a charcoal stick, you can set the stick up here and have it cast a shadow. And if you move this stick up and down, you can see the line of the shadow. You can see where where at the moment it disappears. And you can rather chase that. You can just observe that. If I cast a shadow from this light here, you can see the shadow go under my finger. And you can see that if you move it back and forth, you can rather start defining where the shadow line is. Maybe I'll do it with a point, actually. There's a black point. So you can hold up like a pointed piece of charcoal up and lean it on the cast, and you should be able to see along here the point at which it just disappears, or you can't see it anymore. You begin to be able to define the line of shadow. So I'm hoping you can see what I'm saying. So in this thing here, in this cast here, you'd put that stick right next to the nose and it would cast a shadow, and then somewhere it would disappear. And if you start sliding it up and down, you could actually follow the line. That's just a little bit of confirmation. It's not the best way to proceed. There are better ways, but it does show you that there is a point beyond which no light gets because it doesn't cast shadows anymore. But a shadow will be cast even in the darkest of midtones in that method. So if you have doubts about it, and say in a spot like the neck down here, that may be a shadow, may be a midtone, right? But if you have doubts about it, that's where you can set up a pencil and look at it. Now, this is just pure science in a sense, right? On the other hand, this is not unimportant. This is the way nature presents. There's the light side, the dark side. The light side has all the form. The shadow side is the atmosphere. It's flat, and you don't do form in it. The shadow side has backlight, so it has an element of form, but it's inconsequential, and it's confusing, too, if you overstate it. It's using multiple light sources in movies, as I understand it, is being done less and less. And I would suggest, because it's so noisy, it's difficult on the brain and eyes. Let me just be Mr. Producer can correct me, but he won't do it. But so here you have a shape that is largely a shadow, and then you have lines of shadow all through here, lines. The shadow can jump. It can show up again in odd places. In the middle of nowhere, it can be sitting in the middle of nowhere like this passage does. Or it can be, it can be coming up, be connected. Don't confuse shadows with values, by the way. I'm just going to mention that to you. Because the whole tabletop here is dark. It's darker than any of the shadows in here. But it's not a shadow. It's actually lit. We actually, in our way of working, paint values, not shadows. Do you see what I mean? So what I'm telling you is there's a science of shadows that's useful to know, but we actually find it necessary to proceed, to keep the innocent eye and all the rest of this other stuff, to proceed from the idea of value units and the unity of values. So what that means is when you're massing in this dark thing, this thing here will be joining up into here, maybe into here, this whole mass. Then this mass will be climbing up into here and become part of this. And then it'll go out here and do this and be part of this. So you see that big dark under here has these fingers of, and that's the shape you're actually articulating. Rather than drawing so that's if you're drawing when you're trying to understand the mass, and you need to draw a thing like this accurately. Okay, I'm getting off base. So Leonardo invents this thing, or comes up with a phrase. He didn't invent it. It's evidently in use by Masaccio, in my view, in other places. But he does calm down everything and say, look, there is the line of shadow. There's the point beyond whatever else he says. Read the book. Read his treatise on painting. All right. So let's take that. Now, for a second, I wanted to show you Ang. Ang seems to primarily try to light up from front light, and then in a front light, you don't really have much shadow. I don't know whether this is shadow or not. It could be, right? But this light is nearly front, so it's a little bit from this side, nearly front. So you can see there's not much shadow. But even a skinny little shadow line, that third line, can make a big difference in pronouncing the form. But on the other hand, here he's doing evidently exactly the same thing. Look at the unity. Here's the shadow line. Look at the unity of that value right through there and down into here and blah, 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 whatever else it does, and back up into here and around here, up, back, back. You see what I'm doing? And then this little loop of light inside here, but this is a unified shadow mass. He's very much obeying the idea of flat shadows in that. And so what he winds up having to draw, instead of having to draw arms in invisible places, he winds up needing to draw the line of shadow as part of an outline of the shadow unit, right? And that's the way our thinking goes. So then this begins to introduce the idea of how do you do it, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to show you a little more. This is a studio full of casts, and this is just for you guys who've never even thought about this before. But in each one of these casts, you'll find a line of shadow. Now, this is a soft edge along here, right? A softish edge, not a hard edge. Same thing here along the cheek. There's a line of shadow beyond that midtone. The midtone is what makes that thing appear to be a soft edge, whereas you can see how sharp the outline is over here. But this is another beautiful thing, one of the relief from the Parthenon. And you can see the shapes of the shadows, right? And so it behooves you to understand how to articulate, to see shadow shapes, and to know how to manage the turning side of a shadow shape, shall we say. But that is after the fact, right? Let's talk about that in a minute. But nevertheless, but you can also see here that this whole thing is all lit, and then there's a big shadow on the floor, comes up into here, all up into here, and down through here, whatever else it does. But these shadows are all in the same class. They're all things that are going to have to be dealt with because of the flatness of the shadow itself. Well, I'm saying more than it's going to be helpful to you, I think. So more conversation about it. This is giving you a better idea of the flatness of shadow in chiaroscuro. This is an example of in fact, so is this one actually, but the example of how this guy isn't in the light at all, and therefore he's going to silhouette against a light, right? Whereas this is the shadow line right here. So that could be said to be a shadow line, by the way. Okay. And going around the table, there's your shadow line, shadow line, shadow line. Then it goes up through here, and you can see it's fuzzier from time to time, right? And goes in and out of different places. All right. So as long as you understand that the shadow line, the way we're talking about it, is the demarcation between the lights and the darks, but it's the part beyond which no light gets, then you'll understand that when this thing goes softer, as it were, or a little harder, or very hard in its joint, that's something you're going to have to be working on, that's something you're going to create by middle tones or the absence of them. All right. So here's another wonderful example. That's still a line of shadow. Even if it's cast shadow, you'd still refer to that as a shadow line. You'd be looking for the spot beyond which no more light gets, or somewhere down here. And you do the same thing through here. Where's the part beyond which no light gets? Okay. I think that should be pretty clear. He's doing it like a cutout. In fact, if you look at the background here, you'll see him rather scientifically cutting out the shape of the light. And he does have a tendency to sharpen on one side, turn the other side, but it's still a very big forms and fairly simplistic. All right. I'm thinking I'm taking you into deep zones here. I'm not sure you really want me to do. But look at the shadow line in all these places. You're going to realize that they're very complicated. They're very complex. And how do you handle something as complicated as all that? Of course, the secret is in blurring your eye. If you're looking at this one over here, you'll see that if you blur your eye, there is nothing in the lower half. So the shadow line comes across here, makes inroads here, comes over here, makes inroads up into here, goes over here, then does some stuff and back in through here, joins the entire head and some other stuff, comes back down again, comes back here with another finger. But this is a dark, so you'd say with little fingers going up into it. There are no fingers of light coming down into this shadow as it presents here. These are all backlit, right? This is all a different source of light. It looks like actually there's light from maybe a weak curtain or something down there, but if you think big, you'll understand the main thing is to say, don't you see, this is the mass, this is the shadow line with all its inroads. And then all the significant middle tones that produce form are in the upper half of it. And that just goes on and on like that. But how do we approach it? That's kind of a significant question, and maybe the most significant question. And what I found is that what you want to do is approach it from what reads well. And I alluded to that before. If you have a shadow line on the head, which is lost, let's see this one here, parts of this are lost. So you're going to be addressing this. You're going to be finding this, and you're going to be talking about anything that reads reasonably well. And these things, what we do is we actually float them. And by the way, I recommend that students, when they're first working on these things, float these lines that read reasonably well until they can actually see the shape of the shadow. And don't mass it in or anything like that. Just make yourself good at isolating. So this would be a lost area. This would be a lost area, or depending on how far you're going in. But this definitely has some readability, and therefore you can measure and locate with it. The soggier ones, not so much. So it'd be the same thing down through this little passage right here. You can see how this is relatively lost in through here. The last thing that reads is here. But you can see there's a readability here, and there's a pretty good readability here with a little bit of lostness in there. Well, we're trying to float some of that major stuff out there, and it will elude it. And the minute you put a little bit of a shadow just to a little bit of a value attached to that line, just to the right in this case here, if I'm saying that right, yeah, you will see it highly suggestive of shadow. And I think that's probably what you need to hear. You can see some of the more bony spots like this and this up here. You can see the pursuit is after things that read quite well in the shadow world. Even on this passage here, you can see there's some pursuit of this more than something else. These are the points you're trying to float and use for measuring because they're more fixed. Yeah, the sharper edge, the more fixed, so to speak. And the higher contrast, just the easier it is to see them. If you blur your eyes, you should be able to easily see the ones that are just starting to fade and the ones that stay out there and keep on popping. And so I'm not sure if there's more I should say about that. This is a good example of the sharp boniness here where this has got drift. That's a readable shadow line here. But in the addressing the first time around, and there's a big difference between what you do the first time around and what happens subsequently. So these are three examples. The left one I copied I think, who knows if that was from a book or whatever, but all I was doing was to paint this in the visual order. I was literally looking for things to draw with and how to not draw anything else, because I was following. This is a sort of a following through on the thinking I learned in the Boston School. But you can see the shadow line, how important, how strong that is right there. You see that piece on the top of her head. These are pieces you actually work with. Now, the silhouettes are always going to be things you're working with, these strong silhouettes. But the shadow line, at the point it has drama, especially like this, or like that, at the point it has drama, it's really useful to you. But it not only sets up the proportions or whatever of the abstraction, but it also sets up the form and the object itself in that way, you know. So, yeah, but you can see this is an example. You see this has worked and the leg is lost. This is just an example of visual order thinking. This is done early and often. That's done early and often, so to speak. Even in the clouds, you're going to be addressing things like this first, but that's a little different discussion. So here we are with the tarbell. You can see him. You see how he's isolated the shadow line. This is clearly a question of isolating because that's so flat. Now, depending on where you get caught, you know, you would have probably not left it there. You would have probably rolled the form if it rolled and not left it flat. Maybe you'd have looked at this in the Benson here. You're seeing the shoulder, the shadow line is very sharp and articulate. Then he lets it fade. It's not as useful anymore. And you can see by the clarity with which he's made it, how much use he's making of it. And it's the same thing up in here. You find out there's certain passages he found he could really articulate sharply, and therefore that revealed themselves sharply, so he could then articulate them and make good use of them. So that's a visual order value. It's a huge value of the visual order, is to talk about, let yourself have those strong guys. See this passage here, that's less important there, but this powerful edge is part of the shadow line world. Shadow line being inside here somewhere, but not significantly important. That just that general sense, suggestion, if you want to call it that, of form, is all he's leaving us for the time being. All right, I wonder if there's anything else on that. All right, so this on the right is my demonstration that I often show, or I have often showed online. But it's a pretty clear example of where I can see things well, like this. And by the way, even if it's not really easy to see, but it's the best thing you have to work with, then I use it. But you can see how the chin is rolled, so it's not the shadow line that I'm using there. And but the shadow line is visible here, and you'll notice when they're visible. And of course, if you blur down, they'll remain visible when other things like this passage here may fade, or this really does. We don't even know where the shadow line is up here, do we? But that'd be the same along all these passages here. And if I was laying in this Vermeer in this way of working, you can see that I would be putting time into these highly readable spots like that and that. Eventually out here, right? These are those places that are the setups for the shadow line. If you get those things in the right place, doing the right thing, they do so much work to prepare you for the rest of it. And I think that's all I have to offer you. I think this, let me see if there's something about this start here that I'm trying to show you. Is there anything else on that? I mean, this is just a nice example of visual order start. Oh, I know what it was. So there is a shadow, there's a shadow line inevitably, in the sense that there's a shadow here and there's a cutout light. Now that could have just been a dark, but it was a shadow. And that shadow line then comes down here and does this stuff, and you can still see it here. You can still see a little bit of it here. But down here, this is kind of questionable, right? Where's the shadow line? So it looks like the shadow line is really here, and there's some fusion or confusion about it here. Well, stay out of trying to figure it out, is what I found. Just don't bother. But when you know it's a shadow line, then you know that's for atmosphere, you know that's trying to maintain flatness. You're going to be in good shape. So in all these cases here, we're just trying to find things like this and like this and like this, and whatever forms any kind of, shall we say, bony unit or readable unit that dominates all the others. That's the visual order value. It dominates. And those are the things that you get those right, and lots of things go right for you. Okay, but that's the way we handle the shadow line. in theory, you could smudge this whole thing in as a big fuzz, but you'd have to go through it and find points, some corners, some whatever else. But there's two sides to the shadow line, right? There's this side, the turning side, which is the one the gamma will address dominantly, but then there's the cast shadow side. And then anything penumbra, anything middle tone, though, on that side here, has to consider where it's coming from. Where it's coming from is where the shadow stops, where it stops being absolutely flat as part of the shadow unit. Where that stops happening, it's called penumbra. Everything after that is secondary, with the penumbra sort of suggesting some secondary values. I think that's what I've got. Let's check out your question again. Could you describe more closely how you think of and attend to the line of shadow in your method of painting? Yeah, I think I've done what I'm capable of doing. It might be a case of, again, somebody coming back to me, but just explore this. That's my recommendation. Explore this and see what you can do with it. See how much it helps you. The shadow line in a study the way we did it with Gamble was, the way I did it was we cut out the outline shape. Go back to that cast again. We just cut out the shape and drew it. Gamble was trying to get you to do it perfectly. He came in and saw mine and he said, "That's a Picasso." And sounded like he was making fun of me. But I took what he told me to do to the bank. Everybody else did the same thing. And then he said, "Well, now put in the line of shadow," and described it. And the way we put it in, we just found all the shapes of the shadows and flattened them, and then put no middle tones in. And I recommend you do that as an exercise, just to study up and do research on what the line of shadow does in a setting like that, in a cast. And then the middle tones is everything that happens after. But when you get to painting, we're always painting in visual order. So the shadow line, even if you're doing it Gamel's way, the shadow line is better set up by drawing things that are easy to see, like that piece of this, anything like this, and get those things aligned with each other, and that gets you back to our whole idea of floating, And but you can float lines. This is Paxton talking now. You can float those lines, and you can still gradually get around to the exercise. And I think it was pure exercise. Just closing it in until you've finally seen, and then what the shadow line in its entirety is, the whole length of it. So you've had to find it in places like this. It's very informative to your eyes. It really teaches you a lot about backlight and things like that. When you start thinking, what is that? What is that? And we would always overstate, of course, the reflected lights. Gamble would tell you to don't put them in at all. Just make it flat. And we'll talk about that later. We'll see with how little we can do it, but we'll do it later. But the cutout I'm talking about, it's just simplistic. It looks like a poster or something like that when you get done with it. And it's a terrific exercise. So if you haven't done it, do it. Study up the shadow line. And then what I'm then saying to you is that at some point you can take a broader approach to it, and where you're going to do the shadow line not in a cutout, where you then have to noodle all the midtones in, but you're going to get the middle tones going at the same time. As the shadow line will be on in some places and it'll be slightly turned. The shadow line will be here and down. Once you get down here, it'll be turned right away. So the look of nature, it's always the general impression that you're pursuing right from the beginning. If you can sort that out, but you can find that in other places in our conversations online. So, okay, I'm hoping that's helpful to MP, and I hope he puts it to really good use. All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, and I thank you again for those lovely donations, Stephen, Norma, Linda, Jen, and who am I forgetting? And Lauren K. I think I called you Laura before too. Thank you guys, and thank you everybody for subscribing, sharing, and keeping us going. All right. Next time.